The last few months had been of great uncertainty and uneasiness for the Emperor Lucius Verus and his closest circle, entrusted with directing and managing the most recent war they were waging against the Parthians. The legions, commanded by the empire's most capable generals, had not sent reports of the situation beyond Mesopotamia for more than 6 months, with no news of what became of a large portion of the Roman army. But for the rest of the inhabitants of the east of the empire, it is not so much the absence of reports of the situation from that Roman army, but rather how, for multiple weeks by now, no interaction with the outside world has taken place. No travelers, no explorers from the far east of Asia, no traders, not even a small tribal attack or sack from the Middle East or Arabian desert, nothing, absolutely nothing. It is as if the empire had suddenly found itself disconnected from the rest of the world. Lucius Verus, although concerned by this sudden lack of interaction with the outside world, was still more focused on the lack of any sign of life from his legions. After all, he hoped that they would return in time so that he could return to Rome and celebrate his triumph over the Parthians with his brother Marcus Aurelius, and that, ideally, before the next winter. But for now, the carefree and party-loving emperor would focus on organizing the next big party he was going to hold at his palace in Antioch, wondering which of his luxurious and expensive robes he should wear on that occasion. But it was there that the emperor, preoccupied with choosing his attire for tonight's party with his slave, that he would suddenly hear a multitude of screams of horror throughout the streets of Antioch from the terrace of his palace. Curious and worried by those screams, thinking that these were due to the Parthians invading the city again, he went out to his balcony to see what it was, and what he saw could not be described as anything other than a scene of horror that not even his worst nightmares could have conceived. In the streets of Antioch, without any explanation, a horde of people, or what seemed like people, in a horrifying physical state would begin to attack and devour the inhabitants of Antioch for no reason, like cannibals who had not had food for centuries. The most disturbing thing about these disfigured beasts was that Lucius Verus could recognize many of them wearing clothing or armor characteristic of both the Romans, but also the Parthians, Armenians, and other nomadic tribes of the desert between Parthia and Arabia. And while Lucius Verus was wondering what kind of nightmare the gods had embarked him and all the inhabitants of Antioch into, he, without warning, would be grabbed from behind by one of those things and devoured in a crude and bestial way, suffering in the last moments as no other previously assassinated emperor had suffered. But far from Lucius Verus's knowledge, whatever these creatures were, which we know as zombies, were not only devouring the inhabitants of Antioch, but were actually spreading throughout the entire eastern borders of the empire. And all this because in this timeline, the Romans who returned victorious from Parthia did not return with the first symptoms of the disease, which would one day be known as the Antonine Plague in our timeline, but with a virus much, much worse than the Antonine Plague, a zombie virus. Hello everyone, and today, as the video intro might have suggested, we're going to explore a setting in which the Roman Empire, and most of the world, but it's the Roman Empire that really matters to us, where the Empire of Augustus will suffer a zombie apocalypse, with the virus appearing and replacing what would have been in our timeline, the Antonine Plague. In our real timeline, the so-called Antonine Plague was a devastating epidemic that spread through the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 CE. It was carried westward by the victorious legions returning from their campaign against the Parthians, with most historians believing it was smallpox. A terrible epidemic without a doubt that, as we all know, greatly devastated the Roman Empire at a key point in its history, arriving in the final years of the much-acclaimed Pax Romana. And although its effects were terrible, the empire, despite everything, survived many more centuries after that terrible Antonine Plague, which, I can tell you, is much more than what I can say about the state of the Roman Empire in this crazy and terrifying alternate timeline where the Antonine Plague turned out to be a zombie virus. And before we begin exploring this terrifying world I've created for this Halloween special, let's just make one last interlude to clarify what kind of zombies the Romans will have to face. We will talk about classic zombies, Romero-style zombies, with those being very slow, with a complete lack of intelligence, and moving by pure instinct and inertia due to the herd effect that hordes of those zombies could have on each other, but nothing more. They will be physically extremely weak, and will become increasingly so as the months pass and their bodies decompose. However, as long as they still have what it takes to move, the only way to definitively kill them will be, as always, with a lethal attack to the brain. The mode of contagion will be the classic zombie bite, or accidental interaction with its fluids, be it blood, sweat, saliva, or something else. And as I said, their bodies are dead bodies, so even if they move and eat people, their corpses will still decompose at a normal rate, and worse in extreme conditions like deserts and during the summer. And now, having clarified what kind of zombies the Romans of Marcus Aurelius's time were going to face, it's time to really start this story. So, as I said in the intro, by the time the army reached Antioch around the first half of 166 CE, thousands could have already been infected, spreading the curse before anyone truly understood its nature. There was no concept of contagion, no germ theory, only superstition and rituals back then, and in a society where bodies were often kept for days before burial, the dead would have had every chance to rise again. Yet even in this apocalyptic scenario, the ancient world's geography would have slowed the collapse. Populations were sparse back then, and cities were distant from each other. Plus, the deserts of Mesopotamia would have mummified corpses into brittle husks, making many of the undead useless before they could even reach Roman frontiers anyway. Still, during the year 166 CE, panic would have consumed the east, trade would have halted, caravans would have vanished, and the once bustling ports of Syria and Egypt would have fallen silent. From Rome, Emperor Marcus Aurelius would have watched helplessly as communication with the East simply ceased, without even knowing at the beginning what the hell was happening there. At first, he might have believed the silence to be caused by rebellion or by plague, but eventually, whispers would have reached Italy, tales of creatures that devoured the living, of soldiers who died yet still marched. So, as we move forward in this terrifying alternate timeline, once the infection would have completely consumed Antioch and its surroundings, the situation in the eastern provinces would have turned catastrophic within just a few weeks. The Roman legions stationed in Syria, Cappadocia, and Arabia Petrea would have been caught completely off guard. Many of those garrisons would have initially believed that Antioch was under siege by the Parthians or local rebels, not realizing that the real enemy was something far worse, their own comrades turned into corpses that refused to die. The legions arriving to investigate the chaos would have quickly found themselves overwhelmed. Formations that were trained for open battle would have discovered that traditional tactics, shields, pila, discipline, were almost useless against an enemy that felt no pain, didn't rout, and could only be stopped by destroying the head. At first, the Romans would have tried to fight them as they fought any rebellion, forming lines, shouting orders, and advancing in perfect formation until the moment one of the fallen soldiers would rise again behind their ranks, and then panic would have spread faster than the infection itself, and that would be a pattern that would be repeated in many confrontations with the dead. By late 166 CE, the entire province of Syria would have been lost. Antioch, Seleucia Pieria, and much of the Orontes Valley would have become a wasteland of burning cities and wandering undead. The few surviving officers would have ordered retreats toward the Taurus Mountains, hoping the high terrain and the cooler climate would slow decomposition and buy time to regroup. Meanwhile, the deserts of Mesopotamia would have done their grim work. Most of the undead that had followed the returning legions across those arid lands would have dried out completely, with bodies collapsing into bone and dust beneath the sun. This natural barrier would have prevented a total annihilation of the eastern Roman frontier, giving the empire its first, small advantage in this nightmare. However, the economic and psychological impact would have been enormous still. With Syria and Mesopotamia effectively erased from the map, all trade between Rome and the East would have ceased overnight. The empire would have lost its access to silk, spices, and precious gems. The merchants of Alexandria would have watched helplessly as ships stopped arriving from the Red Sea, and the great economic arteries of the empire would have collapsed. And just as the world seemed to go quiet, the first survivors, exhausted, traumatized soldiers from the destroyed Eastern legions, would have begun to reach Anatolia. Many of them, already infected without knowing it, would have carried the virus further west, spreading death into Asia Minor. It is at this point, around late 166 CE and early 167 CE, that Emperor Marcus Aurelius would have finally realized that the problem was not a local revolt or a plague, but something entirely unprecedented. Most of the East would be gone, and if no immediate measures were taken, the rest of the empire would soon follow. Marcus Aurelius would have found himself facing a disaster without precedent in Roman history. Reports arriving from Asia Minor would have described towns burning themselves to the ground to avoid infection, legions deserting entire provinces, and thousands of refugees flooding westward across the Aegean. In our timeline, Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher, a man who believed in reason and discipline even in chaos, but in this world, those same stoic virtues would have been put to their ultimate test. The first step he would have taken would likely be containment. Ports across the Aegean Sea would have been closed, ships coming from the east would have been ordered to burn their sails at sea and sink rather than risk docking. The emperor would have established quarantine zones along the coasts of Asia Minor and Greece, turning the Aegean into a defensive barrier between life and death, especially once the Romans discovered how long it took for an infected person to become a zombie. Knowing that traditional tactics would not suffice, Marcus would have reorganized parts of the army into specialized detachments whose only purpose was the extermination of the undead. These units would have carried torches, oil, and spades instead of pilum and scutum, trained to burn corpses, decapitate the infected, and cleanse every battlefield with fire and lime. To lead this effort, Marcus Aurelius would have recalled some of his best surviving generals from the Danube frontier, perhaps even men like Avidius Cassius if he had survived the first outbreak, placing them in charge of new fortified zones across Anatolia and Greece. Meanwhile, the great physician Galen, who in our timeline studied the Antonine Plague, would have been called to investigate the nature of this new horror. Through observation and experimentation, he would have been among the first to notice that destruction of the brain prevented reanimation, a discovery that would have become the basis of all Roman anti-undead doctrine. Even with these measures, panic and superstition would have spread almost as fast as the virus itself. Religious cults would have begun to appear, claiming divine punishment or promising purification through fire. In cities such as Ephesus and Pergamon, entire populations would have fled to the mountains, abandoning temples and libraries alike. By the early 170s CE, Marcus Aurelius would have succeeded in halting the advance of the undead at the western coasts of Asia Minor, establishing a line of fortified coastal camps from Byzantium to the Gulf of Smyrna. The Aegean Sea would have become the empire's new frontier, a literal wall of water separating the living from the dead. But even as the emperor secured the east, a new threat would have begun to rise on another front. To the north, the Germanic tribes across the Danube, the Marcomanni and Quadi, would have sensed Rome's weakness and launched their own invasions, forcing the exhausted legions to fight on two fronts at once, against the living and against the dead. It would be then that the age of the Pax Romana would have truly ended. As the eastern seas would have turned into a defensive mode of fire, the northern frontiers of the empire would have ignited in chaos. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatian tribes, long held at bay beyond the Danube, would have realized that the legions guarding those rivers were now weakened, divided, and half consumed by fear. To them, Rome would have looked vulnerable for the first time in centuries, and by the early 170s CE, entire tribal coalitions would have crossed the Danube, storming into Pannonia and Noricum, devastating towns and border forts that had once been symbols of Roman power. The legions stationed there, already stripped of manpower to reinforce the anti-undead campaigns in the east, would have struggled to resist. Villages would have been abandoned, cities fortified, and refugees would have begun to flow southward into Italy itself. Marcus Aurelius, faced with what any ordinary ruler would have considered the end of the world, would have divided his command between two impossible fronts. Half of the remaining legions would have stayed in the Balkans and Greece to contain the undead remnants pushing westward from Anatolia, while the other half would have marched north to confront the barbarian invasion. The situation would have been catastrophic, yet the Romans would not have collapsed immediately. Centuries of discipline and military organization would have given the empire a resilience no other civilization possessed. Field engineers would have built fortified zones behind each front, creating a chain of walled refuges, fortified towns that doubled as population shelters and supply depots. Inside those walls, strict quarantine measures would have been enforced, every corpse burned, every wound examined, every outsider interrogated before entry. It would be during these desperate years that Roman society would have begun to transform, with citizenship no longer being defined by law or birth, but by survival and loyalty. Legionaries would have become a new hereditary caste of defenders, farmers would have been relocated behind defensive perimeters, and entire communities would have turned inward, isolated, and suspicious of strangers. But despite all this, Rome would have endured, at least for now. By 175 CE, Marcus Aurelius would have managed to repel the Germanic invasions temporarily, securing a fragile peace in the north, but this victory would have come at a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, the treasury empty, and the once open highways of the empire reduced to guarded corridors between fortress cities. The empire would have survived the onslaught of the barbarians and the undead alike, but at the price of its own openness. Rome would have become a world of walls, still standing but already beginning to decay within. With the external threats temporarily contained, Marcus Aurelius would have spent the last years of his reign trying to hold together what was left of the empire. But this new Rome, cut off from trade, surrounded by death, and ruled by fear, would have been a very different civilization from the one he inherited. The collapse of the eastern routes would have devastated the economy. The luxurious goods that had once flowed from Arabia, India, and China, like silk, spices, incense, and more, would have vanished completely. Without them, Roman elites would have lost not just their wealth, but their sense of normalcy. Gold and silver would have become useless in a world without markets, and coinage itself would have begun to lose meaning. Grain, salt, and oil would have become the new currency, and regional self-sufficiency would have replaced imperial commerce. Each province, each fortified city, would have learned to rely only on what it could produce and defend on its own. Politically, the unity of the empire would have begun to fracture. With the emperor unable to maintain communication across the ruined trade routes, the governors of Gaul, Hispania, and Africa would have started to act independently, claiming autonomy under the excuse of local security, which, on this occasion, was not really that far of a stretch, or from the truth anyway. These regional leaders would have slowly evolved into semi-independent warlords, each controlling their own legions and enforcing their own quarantine laws. By the time Marcus Aurelius would have died around 180 CE, whether by illness, exhaustion, or perhaps one of the countless smaller zombie outbreaks that would still have occurred, the Roman Empire would already be a ghost of its former self. In this timeline, his death would not have marked the end of an age of peace, but the formal beginning of a new dark, very dark era. His son Commodus, in our timeline, remembered for his vanity and extravagance, would have found himself utterly unprepared to rule such a world. Amid famine, isolation, and constant fear of infection, his games and gladiatorial theatrics would have seemed obscene. The Senate, already reduced to irrelevance, would likely have turned against him, while generals on the frontiers would have seen an opportunity to seize power, and then a good old Roman civil war would have been inevitable, and with that, what remained of Rome's fragile unity would have shattered. Cities and provinces that had once answered to a single emperor would have closed their gates to one another, refusing even to trade or communicate out of fear that the other might carry the infection. For the first time since the early days of the Republic, the Mediterranean world would have stopped being a single interconnected system and turned into a constellation of isolated fortresses, surviving sure, but no longer living. By the turn of the 2nd century into the 3rd, the Roman world would have entered what future historians, or rather archaeologists, in this alternate timeline might call the Age of Absolute Isolation. An era where humanity survived behind stone walls and torches, but where the light of civilization would have begun to flicker and fade as the decades would have passed. As the 3rd century would have dawned over this broken world, the old Roman Empire would have ceased to exist in any recognizable form. No emperor would have ruled all of its lands, no senate would have met in marble halls, and no merchant ship would have crossed the now silent Mediterranean. Instead, the once unified Roman world would have fragmented into dozens of isolated city-states and small kingdoms, each living in constant paranoia of the dead and of one another. Communication between these enclaves would have been almost impossible. Roads, once patrolled and safe, would have fallen into ruin or been deliberately destroyed to prevent the movement of infected travelers. The great Roman highways that had once connected the known world would have become haunted monuments to a lost age of order. Even the aqueducts and granaries that had fed the cities of Italy, Gaul, and Africa would have decayed as maintenance crews died or fled. Yet, the greatest enemy of mankind in this era would not have been the zombies themselves, but the living, as is often the case in movies and shows about a zombie apocalypse. Constant fear would have bred cruelty, communities would have executed strangers on sight, burned boats that dared to approach their harbors, and slaughtered refugees simply to avoid the smallest risk of infection, with survival having replaced compassion completely. By the mid-3rd century CE, much of the Mediterranean population would have perished, not only from zombies, but from famine, isolation, and sheer despair. Regions like Dacia and Britannia would have been completely abandoned. Gaul and Hispania would have reverted to local tribal rule, while in North Africa, small theocratic city-states dedicated to solar or fire cults would have arisen, worshipping light as the symbol of purity against the corruption of darkness. Over time, these societies would have forgotten the truth about the plague that destroyed the world. The zombies themselves would have grown rarer as the centuries passed, slowly decomposing, wandering aimlessly through forests and ruins until they simply fell apart, but the fear of them would have remained. Every generation would have been told the same stories of corpses that walked, of neighbors who burned their own homes, of a world where the dead once ruled the earth. And by the 4th century, the Mediterranean would have become a wilderness. Fewer than 1 million humans might still have lived around its shores, scattered across fortified hilltop settlements. Writing would have been nearly forgotten, trade non-existent, and knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and medicine lost. Humanity would have survived, yes, but the memory of Rome, of its marble cities and legions, would have become a distant myth, a story whispered around fires to frighten children. The zombie plague would have long ended by then, not because the zombie virus would have disappeared, but simply because there were no longer enough humans alive to be contaminated, transformed, and in turn, find other humans to contaminate in time before decomposing. But for sure, its shadow would have endured, not in the form of the undead, but in the fear that any corpse, any stranger, or any whisper from beyond the walls might bring the curse again. This would not have been the fall of a city, nor the collapse of an empire. This would have been the extinction of civilization itself. And yet, as history has often shown, even after the darkest night, life finds a way to return. By the 5th century of this alternate world, after more than 200 years of silence and ruin, the first signs of recovery would have begun to appear. Small pockets of humanity, scattered across the mountains of Italy, the deserts of North Africa, and the highlands of Hispania, would have slowly started to reconnect. At first through cautious signals, smoke by day, torches by night, and later through hesitant travel between neighboring valleys. Generations born long after the last outbreak would have started to question the stories of the walking dead told by their ancestors. Curiosity, that ancient spark of civilization, would have begun to return. Trade would have been reborn in its simplest form, exchange between neighboring villages. Tools, metals, and crops would have been rediscovered through trial and error, and in time, some of these isolated communities would have grown into small kingdoms built upon the remnants of old Roman ruins they no longer understood. They might have walked through broken amphitheaters and aqueducts, believing them to be temples built by gods, unaware that their own ancestors had once constructed them, given that writing would have disappeared and been completely forgotten by that time. It would have taken centuries before anything resembling a civilization reappeared, and by 600 CE, Europe and the Mediterranean would have looked more like the early Bronze Age than the classical world that preceded it, a handful of modest city-states and chiefdoms surrounded by endless wilderness, yet once again, alive. But far across the ocean, the American continent would have remained untouched by all of this. Its civilizations would have continued their own paths, unaware that on the other side of the world, humanity had fallen and restarted again, and they will probably never know, since although I am convinced that even in a situation and context as horrible as this alternate scenario would be, humanity will eventually recover and rebuild, I am also sure that it will take much longer than just 1,000 years before Europeans or other Eurasian civilizations have the luxury of wasting time investing in dangerous and unknown explorations to find out what was beyond the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. The zombie plague would have become legend by then, the great curse, the punishment of the gods, or perhaps the mythic war of the dead. No one would have remembered its true origin, or about the Roman soldiers of Ctesiphon who brought it home. What would have remained, however, is a universal fear buried deep within the human mind, a memory older than history itself, the fear of the dead not staying dead once and for all. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this crazy and depressing alternate scenario about a zombie virus devastating the Roman Empire and even beyond. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel to support me in my work, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to our newest member of the channel, Indiana. Shout out to you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time,